and welcome to American Revolutions in Word and Action, hosted by the Institute for Thomas Paine Studies, or ITPS, here at Iona University. My name is Nora Slonimsky, and I am an associate professor of history here at Iona and the director of the ITPS. Thank you all for being here, both right in the room and to those on Zoom. Before we get started, I'd also like to thank our colleagues in the library for sharing the space, the facilities and catering teams for setting everything up, Aiden and the wonderful faculty services team for ensuring all the tech and hybrid components. My thanks as well to the provost office for providing the funding for the reception and our guests. And also, please eat, there's a lot of snacks, so please get them. With that, it's my pleasure to introduce two friends and colleagues from the CUNY Graduate Center and Brooklyn College, Drs. David Waldstreicher and Ben Carp. Dr. Waldstreicher and Carp have both recently published two fantastic books, The Odyssey of Phillis Wheatley and The Great New York Fire of 1776, both of which are available for purchase online. And for the folks who are on the Zoom webinar, those links are right in the chat. They are here tonight to chat about several of the themes in their books, including communication and political action, and what that means for our understanding of the age of revolutions today. Their conversation this evening will be moderated by the ITPS's public historian, Dr. Michael Crowder. Before we begin, a little bit about our speakers. Dr. Waldstreicher is a distinguished professor of history at the Graduate Center, where he teaches courses on 18th and 19th century America, political history, literary history, and the histories of slavery and anti-slavery. He's published numerous books, including Slavery's Constitution, From Revolution to Ratification, and In the Midst of Perpetual Fetes, The Making of American Nationalism, 1776 to 1820. These books, as well as other scholarship, has been recognized by the Society for the Historians of the Early American Republic, the Omohundro Institute, the Southeastern American Society for 18th Century Studies, and the American Jewish Historical Society. He's also published in the Boston Review, the Atlantic, and the New York Times Book Review. Dr. Carp, also a professor at the Graduate Center and at Brooklyn College, teaches courses on early American history, ranging from the history of violence and to women and gender. His previous prize-winning books include Defiance of the Patriots, The Boston Tea Party and the Making of America, and Rebels Rising, Cities in the American Revolution. Dr. Carp has published numerous articles and held fellowships from dozens of organizations, including the William Clements Library, the David Library of the American Revolution, and the Society of the Cincinnati. Dr. Crowder, who I think many of you know, based here at Iona, manages the public history initiatives at the ITPS and teaches several courses in the history department, as well as in the Columba Freshman Seminar Program. Dr. Crowder is the liaison for several partnerships in public and digital history, including the commemoration of the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution and our internship program, which people should check out if they're interested, which includes placements at George Washington's Mount Vernon and the Thomas Paine Cottage Museum. He's also currently at work on a biography about Paine himself. As a gentle reminder, when it comes time for Q&A, please make sure to speak directly into the microphone so that everyone on Zoom can hear you. If anyone has to leave early, that's no problem, but please just try to exit as quietly as possible. We should have about an hour for the conversation and then can turn it over to the audience for any thoughts you might have. And so with that, I now hand it off to Dr. Crowder.
Thank you very much. This is a huge honor for me because I'm sitting here and I have the opportunity to ask questions to historians who I consider to be mentors and whose work I think about all the time, especially when I'm working on my own work. And this is just very special to me. And I think what I'd like to do, and thank you very much, Dr. Slonimsky, for your introduction. We have two recent books published by each of you, The Odyssey of Phillis Wheatley and The Great New York Fire of 1776. And I think what I'd like to do, Professor Waldstreicher, thinking a little bit chronologically, because Phillis Wheatley's life and her celebrity and her career began in the 1760s, and then Professor Carp, we'll get to your story in the 1770s. In your new book, The Odyssey of Phillis Wheatley, which we should all buy, points out in the introduction, and help me or correct me if I'm wrong here, that Phillis Wheatley, who's an enslaved woman who was brought from Africa to Boston in the 1760s, and who became a celebrity, a political actor, a poet. Can you explain how she became, I suppose, first a poet and then a celebrity and then a political actor? And I don't think that they happen 1, 2, 3. I think you prove in your book that they all happen sort of simultaneously and together. But could you just describe for us a little bit about her meteoric rise? Because she was the first person of African descent, I believe, to publish a book in English, and the third woman to publish a book of poetry in English, which I think is quite interesting.
In North America.
In North America, thank you very much, yes. So do you mind just talking about that a little bit? And so
Sure, it's about 2/3 of the book, but I'll try to make it short. Phillis Wheatley comes over on this ship called the Phillis in 1761. She's about 7 or 8 years old. According to the testimony of her enslavers, the Wheatleys, she's precocious. She's making marks on the wall. She seems to be interested in reading. They teach her how to read. Within a couple of years, she's experimenting with writing occasional poetry, elegies when people die, and what they call occasional verse, like when an event happens and somebody writes a poem about it and recites it. And she becomes known in the neighborhood for this, and by the time she's about 12 or 13, these poems are being circulated. They publish one about a shipwreck in a newspaper in Newport, Rhode Island. And from the poems we have of that period that survive, we see her getting more and more ambitious and experimental. Most of her poems are religious at that time, but she's also writing a poem, for example, on the repeal of the Stamp Act, which thanks King George for recognizing the injustice of the Stamp Act and how all New England is so grateful for the repeal. And a couple of years later, she writes a lengthy poem on the death of the great evangelist George Whitefield. And the Wheatleys had been very much involved in these evangelical circles that were interested in converting colonists, but also converting native people and enslaved people. She writes probably the best elegy on Whitefield's death, and it gets published in newspapers and as broadsides. As a broadside, it gets published in London, and so she becomes well-known extra-locally. It becomes this amazing thing that there is this enslaved African girl who is writing accomplished verse that is learned and in tune with various cultural and political currents. And she, the way I tell the story, she continues to experiment and really broadens her world and makes a lot of connections in the early 1770s at a time when the imperial controversy is ratcheting up. And she puts herself in a position she has basically a volume worth of poems, and they try to get it published, and it doesn't quite work out in Boston. And she manages to get the attention of, with the Wheatleys, to get the attention of some people in England who want to publish her poem there, and she goes over to London, and her poems are published. And by this time, even before the volume is out, there's speculation about what does it mean that there is this young African genius? Does this mean that if treated right, Africans are equal and maybe shouldn't be enslaved? It has potentially anti-slavery implications, and she's quite aware of that, I think, and others are aware of it. And so she becomes not just a poster child for evangelicalism and literacy, but also for the question of what is the future of slavery in the colonies at a time when the Whigs or the folks who are protesting the taxes and the actions of the British administration are comparing their plight, are comparing the way they are being oppressed by not being able to make their own laws to slavery. So her experience her desires, her project gets mixed up not only with the evangelical project and with the issue of slavery, but also with the colonial controversy, and that makes her a real player in the American Revolution. And before long, she's interacting with and being responded to by the people we think of as the real founders: Benjamin Franklin, George Washington, and posthumously Thomas Jefferson. Though all that comes as a result of her writing this poem to Lord Dartmouth, the Undersecretary of State for the Colonies, who's associated with some of these evangelical projects, and who she goes to visit when she's in London, and who is a patron of the arts as well as of evangelical projects. So it's a story, her story is about how somebody networks, makes connections, but also becomes famous in a way that makes them kind of a hot potato and controversial. And the way I tell the story is that she doesn't know what's going to happen. Nobody quite knows how the story is going to turn out. And I guess I'll leave it at that, except to say that as part of her publishing a book and going to London, and the Americans being embarrassed because some of the initial reviews of her book say things like, well, maybe she's amazing, why haven't they freed her? Or maybe she's even not that great a poet, but can you believe she hasn't been emancipated? That she ends up a free person and lives the remaining 11 years of her life, returns to New England, and eventually gets married and has children, dies young, but it's kind of a story about self-emancipation. I guess the equivalent would be a kind of a YouTuber who gets rich today. I use that analogy because that's usually a young person, right? So.
Thanks very much, Professor Waldstreicher. And so I was thinking in so many ways about the connections between both of your work, and you just mentioned a couple of phrases that I want to highlight. You mentioned self-emancipation, and you also just sort of talked about the messiness of the politics of the 1760s and 1770s, and the interesting and yet complicated ways in which somebody like Phillis Wheatley was drawn into it. And in much of your book, and I think the last third in particular, since you just talked about the first 2/3, you really get into discussing how her poetry commented directly, indirectly, obliquely, but always had a political center to it. Perhaps not her elegies for individuals, but you showed that many of them did, actually. And it makes me think, and the title of this event is Words in Action, American Revolutions in Words in Action. And Professor Carp, your book deals with action, but it also deals with words, but in an interesting way, because it deals with the words that were written about an event afterwards, rather than a character like Phillis Wheatley, through her poetry, starting conversations. So could you tell us a little bit, please, just about this fire, this great fire of New York City in 1776?
Sure, yeah. Colonial New York City had actually been quite lucky when it came to fires. Montreal, Boston, Charleston had all had big fires that had burned entire neighborhoods during the colonial period. But New York City had actually been pretty lucky as far as these things go, until the Revolution comes to New York City's doorstep. And so the Americans are occupying the city for most of 1776 until about September 15th, when the British kind of land at Kips Bay and the Americans are kind of sent fleeing to Upper Manhattan. And then 6 days later, a fire, or several fires, begin in the middle of the night and wind up burning about 20% of the city. Now, that doesn't necessarily seem all that historically significant by itself. And in fact, the story that Americans tell about it later is, oh, well, it was an accident, or maybe it was some random miscreants or careless people. And so, okay, bad things happen, especially in a city that has been depopulated as a result of people trying to flee from the conflict. However, if you read the British and Loyalist sources, the fire had started in several places at once. They find incendiary materials stashed in various places in New York City. and they caught people in the act, either trying to set fire to buildings or carrying incendiary materials from place to place in the midst of this fire. And the British soldiers actually catch some of these people and either take them to prison or, in a few cases, throw them into burning buildings and immolate them there. And so the British and Loyalists largely conclude, well, the Americans must have set the town on fire. Granted, the army had left, the American army had left 6 days before, but nothing was stopping them from leaving people in the city, hiding to set this place on fire, or from rowing across from New Jersey, where there were still some American encampments, and picking up torches and beginning to set the city on fire. Later on, a woman is accused of having participated in this, a mixed-race man, and several people in the American army up to the rank of captain. So this sort of astonishing story that most people have not heard of, in which the Americans essentially burned 20% of New York City and then completely denied it, and denied that George Washington in particular had anything to do with it. And so, the title of our discussion today is Words and Actions. I use this distinction in my introduction of words versus deeds, right? That we admire the Americans the most when we think about their great and aspirational words, right? All men are created equal, we the people. Whether Americans have lived up to that or not is another story, but at least we aspire to these grand ideals, these words. But the Americans also commit a lot of deeds, right, over the course of the Revolutionary period, whether it's tarring and feathering or destroying tea or setting houses on fire, that are a bit less lovely. And I'm trying to kind of make the point that, yes, we need to look at the words and the ways that those words inspire us. But in order to really get the fullest possible picture of the Revolutionary era, and particularly the war, right, that we need to see the full spectrum of all the different things that people were doing, not just founders in knee breeches, not just the soldiers, but also women, people of different races, Hessian soldiers, British soldiers, right, a much fuller spectrum of civilians and people at war, in order to really kind of understand the different fates and the different places that the fates took them. Yeah.
Thanks. So this, well, you don't know because I haven't said it yet, but this is making me think, and in one case it may be more obvious, and you've mentioned this in another case, but this is making me think about the role of women during the American Revolution. Of course, Professor Waldstreicher, your book is about Phillis Wheatley, but the book is also filled with other women. It's filled with Susanna Wheatley, who was her mistress. It's filled with networks of women in the Boston area and beyond, back to England, throughout North America. If we can include people who purchased her works and were able to read them, that's a much larger, uncountable number. And you also, Professor Carp, mentioned the role of women, which is one of the most interesting things to me about that book. You have that great section in, I think, Chapter 8. Don't get me if I'm wrong.
Yeah,
Chapter 9.
that sounds about right. Yeah.
About the woman accused, initially, the woman who was accused, and I think was killed.
Yeah,
she was thrown into one of the burning fires. And so this is making me think, like, to what degree should we sort of rethink the role of women in word or in sort of polite networks and also in action? And maybe not rethink it, but is that something that we should be foregrounding more? Because it is a constant theme in different ways in both of your books.
Well, one thing that that became clear to me as I was looking for Wheatley's footprints, and there's the reason there has never been a really full-length scholarly biography of her. There's been one, but there hadn't been one yet when I started. Is that there really isn't, besides her poems and some letters, about 14, 15 letters, there really isn't the usual materials to tell her story. But because she became famous, and because she was in Boston, such a highly literate place, she leaves a lot of footprints, or what I came to think of as footprints. And she's really just a particular example of the difficulty and the challenge of writing about people, and this is especially true of women, for women in early America and enslaved people for early America, who don't get to control the archive and leave their diaries or leave their letters to their descendants, or publish a lot of books. But you can indirectly, by juxtaposing different kinds of sources, try to figure out what they were doing and why. It's really, the book took a long time for that reason. But it is really, it also is about her very careful, indirect way of doing things. And so that I came to see, not only did I come to see her poems as actions that were in effect not only trying to communicate, but actually changing her life or changing the game in the broader, longer run, but that a lot of the things she did and the ways that she talked to people and the ways that she even wrote poems for different audiences for different purposes are like the strategies that, the very feminine strategies that you see within the poems, where she's being very subtle and she is even sometimes deliberately saying things that she knows not everybody will get, but some people will. And that she was remarkably good at doing that. As a result, when people read her, sometimes there was a presumption that she was just copying these classical models and she didn't know what she was doing. But now that we approach her work and works like them with the presumption that, oh, wow, maybe she was actually intelligent, I came to actually approach them with the idea that actually, not only is she smarter than me, but she knows all kinds of things about her world that I don't, even though I've been studying the late 18th century for 30 years. So once you realize that, then it's about figuring out what she is actually doing, and that it might be as subtle and multivalent as I won't want to say a work of scholarship, but I came to think of her poems as like songs that become really popular today, or just in the history of popular music. They work not just because everybody gets them and they have a catchy tune, but sometimes because the words can mean different things to different people. And that's how I came to think of what's so successful about her poetry. And I think the fact that people now can actually read it and like it, and not just see it as old-fashioned again, I think is proof of that.
Can I just ask quickly, do you have a comparison from a modern pop singer to Phillis Wheatley?
Well, I'm not going to out myself as old-fashioned, and I'll worry it'll get back to my 21-year-old daughter, what bad pop culture metaphor. I've gotten to the age where I don't do those things in the classroom anymore. Maybe you guys can still get it.
I had to ask.
Well, when I made, the last time I made this point, it was actually, I had a conversation with this television news anchor named Nora O'Donnell. Maybe some of you have heard of her. I hadn't, but anyhow, she's writing a book about early American women, and I had a conversation with her and two of her staff members. And I was making this point, and she said, "Oh, Taylor Swift." I said, "Okay, I'll take your word for it." I don't know.
I'll leave it to I'm sorry, everybody on Zoom webinar, but I'll leave it to the students in class to decide if the Taylor Swift comparison is apt or not. But Professor Carp, I know you have an answer to the question I asked, but I also know you have a deep reservoir of pop music knowledge, so you can go in either direction.
It's not that much more contemporary, though, however. No, I'm going to duck that question. But in thinking about women in the American Revolution, I kind of come at it from a different angle, which is that, you know, in thinking about the American Revolution or any war in American history, men tend to admire women when they are performing their traditional roles, providing auxiliary support, for, you know, keeping the home fires burning. You know, in the Revolution, it's participating in spinning bees, et cetera, et cetera. We're not used to seeing women picking up guns, right, or engaged in mayhem. And really, you know, Civil War historians are often ahead of revolutionary scholars when it comes to this thing, and so they've seen women like ripping up railroad lines and performing guerrilla actions and things like that. So you can read about that stuff here and there in thinking about the Civil War. And it turns out that if you look long enough, you can find this sort of thing in the Revolutionary War as well. And so I came upon this story, which in a way seems like it's happening at the kind of fringes of the conflict, and yet women seem to be participating in the same kinds of sacrifice, right? Like, assuming this woman was from New York, ready to burn houses and potentially burn her own house on behalf of the American cause, to deprive the British of being able to occupy New York City. And Edmund Burke on the floor of Parliament talks about her, almost in admiring terms, right? That this woman was willing to do this because he's an opposition member of Parliament, and so he doesn't approve of the way that the ministry is prosecuting the war at that point. So yeah, I mean, the presence of this woman is fascinating. I talk about her a bit in the book, and then more in an essay that I published in a volume with UVA Press. Yeah.
I don't think a male enslaved person could have done what Wheatley was able to do with poetry, writing in a way that supported the Patriot movement in Boston, but also beginning and increasingly writing in a way that was critical and that raised the slavery issue. I don't think a male could have gotten away with it. It would have been completely different. I don't think it would have, the genres would have been different. That said, even though Wheatley very successfully writes poems about the war and writes poems, like she slides right into writing praise poems for generals. She writes one for Charles Lee, for Lee. That doesn't work out because it all falls apart for Lee at that very moment. Then she writes one for Washington. She knows how to do war. She knows all about war, and I argue this like that this is very important. But that doesn't keep her from being arguably a victim of the war, in that she becomes a refugee with some of the other Wheatleys. When she gets back to Boston, the family has dispersed, the economy is in shambles. She loses a lot of her patronage, and she decides to get married. And I told you the happy part of the story is that she gets married, she has kids, she chooses to live that kind of a life. But the war does change the whole game for her in a way that she does not get to recoup. We don't know what would have happened if she had lived longer, but she is both part of the story of how the revolution happens and takes the shape it does, but also it's been argued her experience is quite typical in that it has quite severe effects on her personally, even though she continues to be a supporter and celebrant. The last poem she writes is called "Liberty and Peace," and it's a America is Glorious poem. So she doesn't give up on the revolution, but she definitely paid the price for being a participant in it, even if it didn't involve any military action direct. But I think Phillis Wheatley can help us see that that George Washington, the reason George Washington had his thanked her for the poem she wrote about him and got his adjutant to publish it, was that he knew very well that he needed that kind of praise in print from leading poets. And that's why he invites her to camp. He actually, at a moment when they're trying to decide whether black people will be allowed to serve in the Massachusetts militia or in the Continental Army. And they're having those debates, and it's going back and forth. And at the moment they decide, okay, we will keep the free people that have already enlisted. Maybe we won't encourage enslaved people to continue to run away from their masters and join. But this is very complicated. But we're going to say, okay, if that this is unavoidable, and we don't want all the black people on the other side, so we're going to do this. And at that moment, he says, "Oh, I just was praised by this wonderful African genius. Let's make the most of this." It's literally sitting, the poem she writes to him, she writes it in the letter, it's sitting on his desk. He admits that it was sitting on his desk for 3 weeks and that he dug it out. And oh, look, I have this wonderful thing, let's publish it. Actually, he was kind of like waiting and seeing what was going to happen with the military strategy and vis-a-vis the enslaved people, and then he says, okay, we're going this way, we've decided, in that typical wonderful Washington way that he gets praised for, not making a decision on his own, but rather waiting for civilian authorities, waiting for the other generals to make the decision. He makes a decision, and then he accepts the praise, and but if you just look at that, if you say, oh, look, Washington was anti-slavery, Washington liked black people, and then it's been read that way, but we'd like to think Washington had all the answers, but really, he was Washington because he was a savvy political actor, and he knew what Wheatley knew, which was that generals and poets need each other. And that's part of the story. That's part of the Wheatley story. It's also part of the story of the war that Ben is telling.
Well, so that was actually an unexpected link, meaning a link that I didn't mean.
Oh, no, you set the whole thing up.
I
knew you were going that way.
I wish I was that good. And I think all of the students here in class know that I'm not one to lavish a ton of praise on George Washington for no reason. But, he is a common thread. And here you are talking about George Washington playing the politics of race and the politics of slavery in the context of running, I guess that is the word, the Continental Army, being the figurehead for the resistance movement militarily. And that's interesting, that he had Phillis Wheatley's poem on his desk, and he later tried to make sort of a bigger deal out of it, like you mentioned, and sort of take some credit for something. And yet when we pivot to Professor Carp's book, and we find George Washington popping up quite often in the fall of 1776, we see, I don't want to say a different Washington, but a different side of him. Can you describe Washington's sort of role in all of this, please?
Sure. I mean, Washington's the commander-in-chief of the American Army as the British have this massive force in New York Harbor. He loses at the Battle of Brooklyn. He manages to save his army. And he basically has three choices about what he's going to do. He can either try and defend New York City, but he realizes he'll be wiped out if he tries to do that. So his other choices are he's going to retreat from New York City, therefore, but he can either leave it intact, allow it to become a British headquarters and naval base and all this other stuff, or he can burn it behind him. Classic scorched earth tactic, something that any general would have been aware of. But because he's politically savvy, he knows that burning New York will look bad. And because he's always consulting with civilian authorities, he doesn't want to stick his neck out and burn it on his own. He wants to consult. So first the New York legislature approaches him and they say, we've heard this rumor that your army is going to burn New York City on the way out. Could you do something about this rumor? Because it's going to make us all look bad. And then Washington's like, well, all right, I better ask Congress. And he writes to Congress and he asks them for permission about whether he can burn New York City. And Congress tells him no. And so most people who have looked at this correspondence say, well, that's all we really need to know. But interestingly, a letter that, as far as I know, historians didn't even use until the 1940s. After the fire, he writes to Lund Washington, a cousin of his who is kind of acting as caretaker for Mount Vernon. And he says, Congress didn't let me burn New York City, but it was a huge mistake. And then a paragraph or so later, he says, by the way, Providence or some good honest fellow has done what we didn't see fit to do for ourselves. And about a quarter of the city is burned. However, enough of it remains to answer the British purposes. So he's like a little bit cheeky there and kind of saying like, yes, in the above board conversation, I asked Congress and they said no. And yet, look at this happy accident that God or some honest fellow has burned New York City anyway. And so some historians have sort of concluded a little bit like maybe it was sort of like saying, well, no one rid me of this meddlesome priest, right? Like, he went to his officers and said, well, no one rid me of this troublesome city. And one of his enterprising officers was like, all right, you, and you, sneak into New York City, set fire to the place. The general will be happy if you do it, but don't make sure his name isn't attached to this at all. And then what I think is the most interesting part of the book is what then happens in correspondence and the press after the fire, which is that Washington's inner circle really goes to work and says, all right, a lot of Americans were saying we were going to burn New York City before this happened. Then it happened, but we don't want you to connect those dots. And so they begin putting out this story, no, like, we had nothing to do with it. We have no clue what happened. It was probably an accident. But look over there, the British are behaving so savagely. The Hessians are plundering. The British are killing women and children. They begin just making stuff up in order to put like all this kind of scuzzy disinformation out there in order to distract people from seeing what I think must have been pretty obvious to everyone, which is that after months of the Americans saying they were going to burn New York City, that was exactly what they had done. And so Washington goes down in history as not having set this fire, right? You read all the biographies of Washington, even British, histories of the American Revolution say there's no way that Washington would have countenanced such an act.
So
This is the danger of doing history from character, where, oh, well, Washington's character is this, thus that he must not have done that. So Phillis Wheatley was an enslaved person. She couldn't have done, right? She couldn't possibly have been that savvy or have, I mean, the beginning of it was the doubt that she had actually written the poems at all. But ever since then, it's been people reasoning from what we think enslaved women could be or were to interpreting her poems and not even being able to read them because of who we think she was.
And of course, one thing we know for certain about Washington is that he did give the order for his men to burn Iroquois villages, right? Iroquois towns during the Sullivan-Clinton campaign of 1779. So Washington was no stranger to the torch, but for whatever reason, his reputation needs to be protected from the idea that he might have set New York City on fire.
who did set New York City on fire?
Who did it?
Yeah.
Well, so again, right, anyone who's fans of the show The Wire, here's my pop culture reference for the day, right? You don't keep notes on a criminal conspiracy, right? And so historians are unlikely to find the document that said, here's our list of conspirators to burn New York City, right? Instead, the evidence comes from a variety of places, and I have this cast of characters of people who were later accused of having burned New York: a 57-year-old New York City tavern owner, a spy from Baltimore, this woman that I mentioned before, the mixed-race man who is a group of 8 soldiers from Connecticut who rode over the Hudson River to burn New York. So, and other men whose names are associated with this deed. So again, right, like all of the evidence is imperfect, right? And so we just have to kind of recreate, all right, are these the people who were likely to do this? And the work that I had done on the Boston Tea Party was experience with this, because we don't know for sure that any of the men who later claimed to have participated in the Boston Tea Party were actually there. And yet, by looking at the men whose names were at least attached to it, I kind of created a social profile. Okay, they tended to be about this age, this level of political experience, they had these kinds of jobs, et cetera, et cetera. So I tried to do that with the people who were associated with burning New York City. And what I concluded is that they represent a kind of radical element within the Revolutionary War effort, right? The people who were willing to kind of take the American war effort to the extremes, right? No more being moderate, trying to avoid a war of retaliation. The kind of people who are willing to push the envelope. We've got to keep New York City out of the British hands at all costs. We're willing to do something that won't necessarily look good, but it'll be for the Americans' strategic advantage, right? So, so that's where you might see more radical Congregationalists, Presbyterians, people who were willing to deploy women and people of color even to burn New York City.
So that makes me think of another link that I did not expect to make, but I'm going to do now. So please bear with me. And I hesitate to use these phrases, but I will because they're part of our parlance now. Misinformation / disinformation. And that is a theme that I saw in very different ways. Not that either of you use those words, but I wonder if you could comment on it, and I'll give you a little bit more of a leading comment. I mean, one of the things that's so interesting about Phillis Wheatley and her rise to become a celebrity, and perhaps this is just my reading, Professor Waldstreicher, of your book, is that one of the reasons she went to England was to try to attract attention to her poetry. But also, and you sort of suggested this earlier, but not in the way that I'm asking, but I got the impression so that people in high places could see that she was a real person that actually existed, because they found it difficult to imagine that a teenaged enslaved girl, when she started writing her poetry, could possibly have the kind of insight and have the kind of classical inspirations that she did. And the way I read your book was that one of the reasons she did that is because to show people I'm a real person. But I think it's interesting that, and I think a couple of places in your book you mentioned that there was discussion about who she actually was, or about, not about who she was, but about her background, and in the context of trying to counter the political arguments that she made in her poems. Did you find that there was not disinformation so much, but a need to verify information about her and verify her veracity? I guess it's a little redundant, as a legitimate poet, somebody who we should take seriously as an artist who's becoming a political actor while being an enslaved woman?
Yeah. One way of thinking about it is that we're still trying to figure out who she was, what does it mean that she did what she did, and people at the time had similar questions. That's part of what it is to be a first or to be a genius, but it did raise all these questions of how do you know? How do you know to trust what you read? How do you know someone wrote the things they said that they're going to write? And this is I tread a little bit. I don't attack this directly in the book, because the thing that the most people know about Phillis Wheatley, or the scene that's most famous, is this idea that she underwent a trial. Henry Louis Gates calls it the trial of Phillis Wheatley, where supposedly all these Boston ministers and worthy and lawyers and judges had her come in, and they grilled her. They asked her questions to see if she really wrote her poems, and was a person who could write those poems. And that it's a very vivid image, and Gates, in a famous essay that became a little book called The Trials of Phillis Wheatley, used it to say, this is the dilemma of the black writer, and maybe of all black people in a white society. You're always under suspicion. People are always wondering if you're for real. So, and Wheatley's reputation went up and down. She was appreciated by black people, forgotten by a lot of white people who weren't anti-slavery. And eventually, the people didn't understand the anti-slavery dimensions of her poetry. And some black writers, especially in the 20th century, said that she was an Oreo or an Uncle Tom because she wrote in a white style and she didn't talk directly about her experience, and she wasn't Afrocentric, she wasn't radical enough. So that there's been a debate about, and so Gates also wanted to say this was like Wheatley's second trial. She's like, we're still making her undergo this trial and not like really hearing her and appreciating her. So that was very important that Gates wrote that book and told the story that way. The problem is the trial never happened. They never got her in a room in Boston and grilled her. The reason it seems that way is that there's a page in the frontispiece of her book, published in London, that says, we the undersigned attest that Phillis Wheatley wrote these poems that are in the book. And it's these 12 well-known, very established Boston people. But they didn't put her under a trial and then sign the piece of paper. They all knew her already. She had written poems about them. She had been in their parlors.
Sorry, could I just? I'm sorry, quickly. Why did she need to have attestations to her?
She needs to have the attestation because it has to travel to London. Because it's there that they're asking. Because they haven't seen her. The people, everyone in Boston knows that she wrote them because they've seen her and they've heard her. So so it really is. How do you know? How can you trust what you read? It really is about these printed products that are okay. They're printed. That makes them seem real, but it's like, yeah, so we have to think of the print in the 18th century as like the internet today. It's really exciting, it's new, it's expanding, it's all around us. it's making connections with everything, but like sometimes it's BS. Some of it is not true. Some of it is misleading. Some of it is misinformation. So this question of of inspiration, information versus lies and bad politics and everything's going to hell because people are lying, and they may even be lying about their faith as well as about their politics. And if you read about a war going on or things going on the other side of the ocean, how do you know what's really going on? These are very real things for people. And so Wheatley's path is bound up with these questions about the veracity, about misinformation and the veracity of print. But how she gets over there is bound up with this too, because this guy who knows Lord Dartmouth comes to see her in Boston, and he says, this is great, but I hear, he pretty much asks the question, how do I know that you're really for real? And could you write a poem about Lord Dartmouth? And so she says, come back tomorrow. And she writes this amazing poem about Lord Dartmouth. I think she'd already written it, actually. I think she had it in her pocket, and she knew this guy was coming because there's evidence that there was some connection with his wife, and maybe she's the one who got him to go there. So again, women. So then she engineers this scene where he's amazed by this poem, and he sends it over to Lord Dartmouth, and that sets up the whole going to London, going to Lord Dartmouth. But she also does it with this 70-year-old guy, Lord Lyttelton, who is a patron of poets going back 30, 40 years. He'd been a friend of Alexander Pope. He's one of these aristocrats who had been, if any ordinary person has written a volume of poems, they go to Lord Lyttelton, and Lord Lyttelton shows it to his friends and pledges to subscribe to the book. And it's happened so many times that they give him a nickname. He's like the patron of poets. They call him Maecenas, who was the patron of Horace and Virgil in Roman times. And so and then Wheatley goes over with her manuscript, and the first poem in Wheatley's manuscript and in her book is called To Maecenas. So for decades and decades, people have been asking, who is Wheatley's Maecenas? Who's her patron? Is it Mrs. Wheatley? Is it Mather Byles, one of these Boston ministers? Is it Countess Huntingdon? I figured it out. It's Lord Lyttelton. She's right. She knows she's going to go to London, and she's going to try to get the endorsement of Lord Lyttelton, which is going to be like a good blurb for the book. And everyone who knows about Alexander Pope and Lyttelton, and who is like basically up on the whole British poetry scene, is going to completely get this poem and what she's doing in it. And in it is that's how she shows she knows what she's doing. By like not only by like getting Lord Lyttelton's approval, but being able to write this kind of poem that knows who's who and what it means to write a Horatian poem in praise of a possible patron. So again, and what is all this about? This is all about being taken seriously because you show that you get all the cultural references and you're a participant. You have things in common with people. You've all read the same books. You get the same references. And like, I'm not this foreign person. I'm a British poet. In some of the poems, I'm going to talk about being African, but like, I'm going to meet you where you are and show that I'm part of your world. And that's what she does. That's how she says, I'm not misinformation. I'm the real deal. So I'm sorry to go on so long, but that like hits like the real essence of the book. And being able to do that enables her to be bolder and bolder about criticizing slavery, which she starts to do around that time.
Yeah, she used the not misinformation, but the confusion about her identity. She leveraged it to her benefit. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you.
So it's much more than being declared innocent at a trial.
Right.
I mean, the trial is every day, and she is like changing the whole nature of the scene.
I mean, when you think about it, the fact that George Washington had copies of her poems on his desk in the same moment that or a couple of months after he's thinking about maybe burning down New York City, or maybe not. It's just like it attests to how she was seemingly everywhere at the same time, just in terms of reputation. But then there were questions about her identity. I mean, the idea of the attestations is fascinating, right? That she needed white men and women to prove her identity. But speaking about proving things and not proving things, Professor Carp, one of the things I love the most about your book is the later chapters, in which both sides, the patriots and the loyalists, the Whigs and the loyalists, attempt to shape the news cycle. I guess we could use that phrase now. And I think actually misinformation and disinformation are much more appropriate for your example. So can you talk about that? And you've talked about who started the fire, obligatory Billy Joel reference, but could you talk about how that was reported?
Yeah, sure. I mean, people at the time tended to read newspapers and that were going to confirm their own prejudices, essentially, right? They're looking to read something that tells them something about what they already know or that supports their political cause. And so if you look at the Loyalist newspapers, they say this was an accident. The Americans deliberately waited until New York City was going to be particularly vulnerable to fire. They waited for the wind to pick up, and then they were all there. They did it, et cetera, et cetera. And so they're trying to bring more Loyalists under their umbrella. And so the Loyalist newspapers say, you foolish New Yorkers, those of you who supported the Whigs, now look what you get. Our city is burned down, and this should show you that no one should support this American rebellion ever again. Then you read the rebel newspapers, and they say, nope, it was an accident. Couldn't possibly have been Washington. And like I said before, and look over there. Look at how much the British and the Hessians are misbehaving. Now, with misinformation, you don't actually have to come up with a contradicting story and get people to believe it. You just need to come up with some other story that speaks to those prejudices and then get people all hopped up about that instead. So if you can get people all hopped up about the British people slitting people's throats and Hessians plundering and the British Army killing women and children, then they're hoping that everyone will focus on, oh yes, I already believed that the British were committing atrocities. Now this confirms my set of beliefs about that, and now I'm not thinking about whether the Americans set fire to New York City at all. That's the way the misinformation campaign worked, right? And so by November, there's a Philadelphia newspaper saying, yeah, can you believe they accused us of setting New York on fire? And then the issue is largely dropped for the rest of the war. Every once in a while, somebody like New York's governor, William Tryon, will be like, I can't believe you're always complaining about us, the British burning American cities. Didn't you guys burn New York? And and then the Americans respond like, how dare you even entertain such a crazy notion? Nobody thinks that. And it was true, right? The American reading public didn't think that. And I mean, one of the really interesting things that I found in that chapter is that in the initial days after the fire, plenty of American soldiers and officers are writing, oh yeah, our guys probably did that. And it's only once Washington's officers and Benjamin Franklin get to work that all of a sudden the party line becomes, no, the Americans couldn't possibly have done such a thing. And so, yeah, misinformation is an important thing for me. And the subtitle of my book is A Lost Story of the American Revolution. The reason this story gets lost is that the Founding Fathers did their best to make sure that the story disappeared.
Right, and one of the problems in this field, in particular, is because so often the story gets told from character, rather than looking at actually what happened in time, as Ben did, for example, in seeing how the story got changed. If you're looking for character, it doesn't matter when George Washington said a certain thing; it's what he said. So he always told the truth, right? And he wasn't political in that way. He wasn't saying different things to different people. He didn't change. His beliefs didn't change, or his essential outlook didn't change. And it's easy to go down this route because a lot of the times George Washington wants to be that principled person who's always consistent and always upright. It's very easy to read George Washington and start to talk about George Washington the way he wants to see himself and the way he and Americans needed to see George Washington.
Yeah, well, I mean, one of the things I find about Washington in 1776 is he spends most of the campaign complaining about how undisciplined his soldiers are, right? And he's writing to Congress and saying, you've got to change the Articles of War. I need to be, 39 lashes, a limit of 39 lashes, to punish soldiers. It's too small. I need to be able to up that to 100, right? He's asking to be able to inflict harsher punishments. Right. I want there to be a larger list of crimes from which I can hang one of my soldiers. Right. He is disgusted with his army's performance in 1776, and I think a lot of the soldiers in turn were really resentful of their officers, especially after the Battle of Kip's Bay on September 15th, 6 days before the fire. I have evidence that a lot of Connecticut soldiers, after the way they felt they'd been treated and the way that they were being maligned by their officers, that they were ready to frag their officers. I saw one little piece of evidence suggesting that the American soldiers themselves were so disgusted with their own officers that they were ready to do something about it. And so my other theory in the book is that maybe Washington ordered the fire, maybe not. I don't really have ironclad evidence, suggesting that, but it's quite possible that ordinary civilians and soldiers and a couple of field officers burned New York City in defiance of what their officers wanted them to do, or at least in defiance of what the standing order was supposed to be, that many of them may have just taken it into their own hands to be like, I hate the British, I hate the Church of England, I hate New York City's loyalists, and I even hate my own officers. And so, I'm gonna channel that rage into burning down New York City as a way of getting back at all of these people.
And then what we call leadership becomes controlling the story and trying to make lemonade out of lemons.
Right, yeah, and apologizing for the fact that you've lost control.
No, I mean,
it's covering up the fact that you've lost control.
It does say a lot that you showed in your book, and you mentioned this earlier, that the people who had patriot sympathies, who were closest to it, were like, yeah, we did it.
Right.
Pretty sure. And then, as you mentioned, that changed. Once it got up the chain of command, that's when the decision was made to kind of move
Right.
away from that.
This is going to look bad in front of the Europeans and the British and a lot of the American public too, right? Like this is like not so morally clear, and so maybe we better leave it to one side.
Right. So it's been an hour. Do y'all? Excuse me. I'll speak more.
There's the Texas coming out.
There is the Texas. I'll try to be more articulate. I think, Dr. Slanimsky, do we have any Zoom questions? Well, then I'll walk over and hand you. I'm sorry, who was it? Oh, please. Thank you very much, professors. And we'll go to our Q&A portion.
Okay. So did they know, so they burned New York to protest the British, or did they not know why they burned New York? I was just a little confused about that part.
Sure. I mean, from a strategic perspective, the British had basically taken New York City, right? And so they were going to be able to enjoy it as a winter headquarters, enjoy it as a naval base. They were going to be able to open the city's markets to farmers from all around Long Island and New Jersey and Connecticut, right? And basically, right, the British would be able to use it in order to try and reestablish control over that part of the colonies, right? Now the British have access to the Hudson River. They have access to the Connecticut shoreline. They have access to New Jersey, right? There's all sorts of advantages that accrue to the British if they're sitting there in New York. And so what the Americans decide to do is, well, we can't necessarily do anything about the army occupying some of the island, but if we get rid of the infrastructure of New York City, if we could somehow burn the shipyards and everything, then we'll be able to do some damage, and slow the British down. Now, the fire doesn't get to the shipyards. It doesn't damage the most commercially valuable parts of the city. So in that sense, the arsonists kind of failed. What they burn instead is the Customs House, Trinity Church, the Lutheran Church, and then a few of the mansions along Broadway, and then actually a bunch of wooden working class housing that was on land owned by the Church of England. And so that's what burns because of the direction of the wind for the most part. There may have been other fires that were started elsewhere in the city, but they don't catch to the same degree. And so most of this part of the city that was in the central part or along the East River largely remained intact. Anyway, the strategic goal of the fire would have been to deprive the British of being able to take advantage of occupying New York City.
Thank you very much for your question. And if I were a proper television journalist, which I'm not, and knew how to run a proper Q&A, I would have asked, and you sort of referred to it, but sort of corresponding to today, what parts of Manhattan were burnt? I know that Lower Manhattan Island is quite a bit larger now because It's been infilled.
It's everything from Whitehall Slip, which is where the Staten Island ferry leaves from. The fire then goes a little bit north, goes around the north side of Bowling Green, jumps over Broadway, and then pretty much burns everything between Broadway and the Hudson River up to about what's now Park Place, which is halfway up City Hall Park. So that's the area that burns. You know, a small part of today's New York City, but about 20% of the urbanized part of New York City at the time.
So it'd be like the sort of western edge of Lower Manhattan.
I mean, it's around where the World Trade Center is, but the World Trade Center is built on landfill, right? Greenwich Street and everything west of it were all parts of New York City that didn't exist in 1776.
Any other questions? Ed, please. And let me come give you the microphone, just so people can hear you on the Zoom webinar. Sorry. Thank you, Ed.
Her name is Phillis Wheatley, right? You said she was involved in evangelical projects. What would that be?
There were there was a okay. Well, how do I want to briefly? One of the evangelical projects that, in the wake of what's called the Second Great Awakening or the revivals, was to send missionaries out to natives in Iroquois and in New England. And this was a kind of transatlantic project that some folks who were associated with Whitefield and with the Methodists were involved in, and the Wheatleys were, and for example, Samson Occam, who was a Mohegan, who had trained at the school that some of the Wheatleys' relatives had worked at, and then went to England to preach and raise money for this school that was going to train natives to then be the missionaries. And this was a major project that got a lot of publicity, and that had its ups and downs, but that Wheatley and that Phillis Wheatley and Susanna and John Wheatley were very much aware of and very much part of. So there's a kind of I stress it in part because her poetry is religious, but in part because there were significant numbers of the people who supported her, especially early on, who took it for granted that the whole point of teaching an African to read is so that other Africans can read the scriptures and be converted to Christianity. So that it's kind of inseparable from how she becomes who she is, the evangelical project. But she never completely leaves it behind, but it becomes, you could say, her stepping stone, but that makes it sound like she wasn't committed to it, and I'm not saying that, but it is the ground on which she builds her project, and really, it's unthinkable that she could have published as much, or had the connections she had, especially among the network of females like the Countess Huntingdon in England, who sponsored the book, without the what we call the evangelical project. And that's why some of her poems sound distinctly like she's preaching. She takes on a ministerial role, because that is a kind of authority that pious women could claim, and was a source of strength and power and inspiration for them.
Well, if no one has another question, I can jump in. I have one that's for both Dr. Carp and Dr. Waldstreicher. Ben earlier in the talk made a reference, right, about ridding people of troublesome priests. And Henry II kind of gets a much rougher deal, right, than George Washington does. For anyone who doesn't know the reference, Henry II is a king who has a pretty big falling out with his best friend, Thomas Becket, when he makes him the Archbishop of Canterbury, which is the highest priest in England. He thinks he's going to stay his friend, but then once he gets the job, his interest really shifted out of the church. They have a really public falling out, and then a bunch of